Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. As the U.S. grapples with the consequences of a fractured Republican Party, the former conservative leader in this country is calling for less polarization on the right and the left. In a blog post, Erin O'Toole expressed concern about anti-Trudeau flags and sentiments, calling Trudeau his opponent but not his enemy. He also says hyper-aggressive rhetoric is normalizing rage and damaging democracy. The current Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, was asked about the comments.
I have never seen so much hurt and so much pain and suffering in our population in my nearly 2 decades in politics. So yes, of course, we should tell people to be more civil and to reject offensive signs, flags, and language. But we should also ask ourselves, why are people hurting so badly?
So what's to be made of O'Toole's warnings about polarization, and is it, as he suggests, the duty of elected officials to bridge that divide? Let's bring in our panelists. Chantal Hebert, Andrew Coyne, Althia and Kelly Cryderman joins us this week from Alberta. Good to see everyone. There's lots of interesting things here in the post, but also the person who posted it. But let's start about the content, if we can. Chantal, what did you make of Erin O'Toole's warnings there and what he had to say?
I guess it was a welcome contribution, maybe coming late in the game because I did follow, it's my job, Erin O'Toole's social media feed, which he probably wasn't handling when he was leader. Yeah. And it was all about how Justin Trudeau was responsible for everything that was wrong on the planet. Now, if that's your message, you shouldn't be too surprised about flags that go way over the line. I think the part of his message to the Conservatives, because he did admit that it was mostly Conservatives who were indulging in this kind of hate approach to politics. I think the message to current Conservatives is that if you cater to people who are in that register, you're probably going to turn off people who used to vote Liberal and might consider you as an option and will not on that basis.
It was interesting too, Andrew, that it came from Mr. O'Toole, given that a lot of the election where he ultimately ended up losing and then lost his job seemed to be very polarizing, whether it be about vaccine mandates or guns or other things.
Yeah, I mean, I thought he struck a very statesman-like tone in this message that frankly was absent from the remarks of his successor. I will say, I think polarization isn't quite the right word. I think I've made this point before, but I'll make it again, which is that, we don't have a 50-50 split like you have in the States with a great, huge no man's land in between that nobody dares cross. And polarization itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. We were polarized over free trade, but that's because there was a big decision we had to make as a country. The problem is extremism. And there's some of it on the left, but these days it's more of a problem on the right. And it manifests itself in this kind of hate-filled messaging. That's not a function of the state of the economy or what have you. I mean, I'm a little older than Pierre Poilievre, but I can remember when there was a lot more hurt and suffering, when we had double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment and double-digit interest rates all at the same time. But even if you have a lot of suffering, it doesn't excuse, as he seemed to be tiptoeing up to, this kind of behavior. The people who are putting out this kind of hateful message aren't complaining because they think the government is incompetent. They think Justin Trudeau is a unique threat to the country, that he's guilty of treason and tyranny and everything else. There's lots to dislike about this government, but there's lots to dislike about most governments. And the notion that this is something we've never seen and this is the worst thing we've ever had to deal with is just ridiculous.
Althia?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think it was nice to hear Erin O'Toole read it was good to hear and read his thoughts on that. I would have liked to have him reflect on that while he was still, frankly, in a position of power, much like I would have liked Jason Kenney to, it's like they realized after they fed the beast and the beast basically ate their face off that, oh, maybe it was a bad thing that we did that.
Right.
And it would be nice if politicians realized that putting their personal and partisan interests ahead of the common good by feeding that anger, by fomenting that anger and that polarization, or those extremes, as Andrew would like us to describe them, that has really negative consequences. And we see that, down south.
And Kelly, I would imagine that's an easier message, frankly, to give in the position that Mr. O'Toole is in now compared to where he was, like it or not, whether he should have done it before or not.
Yeah, there's a sense of distance there, and you can see that in that statesman-like tone and in, setting it from the top, criticizing his own party members from the top, I think gives him a lot more credibility in delving to the issue. But, he does point out that there is hatred and rhetoric on both sides. He does talk about the people who said, stop Harper when Harper was in power. And I think at that time they felt like Stephen Harper was a unique threat to the political culture of Canada. I think a lot of people felt that. So I don't know if that's changed. In many ways, on the left, they are winning on the social media side, that they are funnier or snarkier and win on that side. And I think the anger on the right is a different beast and sometimes more blunt, a more blunt force.
Chantal.
But I think he speaks from a lot of authority because he criticizes both sides.
Right, Chantal.
But I think what's different, and I'm like Andrew, I'm a bit older than Pierre Poilievre, and I've seen people who were more unhappy about the state of things. I've also covered a series of prime ministers who ended up being hated, not always for the right reasons, by a section of the electorate. What's different this time is what you're seeing in Washington now. It is a threat to the capacity of the conservative movement to put together a coalition that is large enough to take government. Mm-hmm. It is at the point where the tail is wagging the dog, and the dog is saying, please wag more. And I think that's the bottom-down message. If that's what the game you want to play, you will not make government. People will distrust you. And watching what's happening in Washington, also what happened to Jason Kenney, I think that Jason Kenney's fate had a profound impact on the thinking of many conservatives elsewhere in the country.
And so, Andrew, is that a message that Mr. O'Toole is sending to the party, to Mr. Poilievre? And if it is, in terms of how Pierre Poilievre responded, what should we take from that?
Well, I thought it was very much directed at the Conservative Party, and with good reason. And the point I think that he made, and I would make as well, is this has nothing to do with ideology. It has to do with temperament and judgment. You can be as conservative as you like, and in my criticism over the years of the Conservative Party has often been that they haven't been conservative enough. There hasn't been a robust ideological difference between them and the Liberals that made it worth considering them as an alternative to government. But you can do so in a way where you're attempting to persuade people rather than just shout them down or beat them over the head, where you yourself have been persuaded by facts and reason, not just ideological dogma, where you have an awareness of what's possible and what means are appropriate to achieving your political ends, and you rule out certain other means, where you don't consort with extremists and I shouldn't say radicals, but hooligans, basically, as we saw in the streets of Ottawa. And all these things seem to have certainly gone by the boards in the United States. The people who are gumming up the works now in Washington don't have any coherent agenda of any kind. It's just rage and self-importance and everything else. And you've seen some of that in the same sphere in Canada, where people are losing contact with reality, losing contact with what's possible, and where political leaders, rather than trying to bring people back into the mainstream and trying to make bridge these kinds of divides, are simply exacerbating it.
Althia?
Yes, I agree with Andrew in the sense that it was very statesmanlike and it's a reflection, a message to Conservatives. But I also think it's part of Erin O'Toole's rehabilitation. I don't expect that Erin O'Toole will be running again for a seat in the House of Commons. And I think he is kind of trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube from some of his own behavior, mostly when he was running for the Conservative leadership. The one thing that I think is important, and I don't remember who mentioned it, but I think what has changed from the Stop Harper signs to the F Trudeau signs is the behavior around your political opponents being your enemy, being traitors to the country, that dehumanizing language, the kind of language that we saw from Elliot McDavid, that the man in Grand Prairie, Alberta, who verbally accosted Chrystia Freeland in August, which I think for a lot of people was the first time that they saw kind of that anger directed at somebody being called a traitor, being told that you were destroying the country, that your children were not going to have a future because of Ms. Freeland's actions. That is different. And when your enemy becomes a traitor, and when you believe things like the Prime Minister is purposefully starving millions of Canadians through fertilizer limitations, that has an enormous consequence, because we're no longer talking about facts, and it makes it really hard to govern for the majority of the country.
30 seconds, Kelly.
I think, a lot of political movements are motivated by anger, and I think part of a politician's job is to funnel that anger in a productive way, maybe in a way that speaks to our better angels. And I think what Pierre Poilievre has done is spoken to what makes people angry. Certainly, whether you're talking about housing costs or inflation, what he hasn't done is really presented options and governance options on that front.
The federal government is preparing to unveil its legislation to transition workers from the oil and gas sector to green energy jobs. Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson says the plan will likely create more opportunities.
This is about creating a future that will create good, well-paying jobs and economic prosperity in every region of this country.
But some oil-producing provinces are concerned about the effect the legislation will have on thousands of workers and the industry. So is the Just Transition Bill the death knell for oil and gas, as some provinces are saying, or will it help bring about the shift to green energy, as the Liberals are hoping? Let's bring back our panelists, Chantal, Andrew, Althia, and Kelly. Kelly, you're in Alberta. I'll start with you, because it's certainly the Alberta government that's had the most fierce reaction to this so far. Is it based in reality, or do they need to get involved in this plan to try and influence it in some positive way?
Well, I think, the first thing you always got to lay out is that the UCP government here is in the throes of a very competitive election with the NDP, and that colors everything they do. Where they can win is sticking up for Alberta's economic interests, and you will hear that from now until the May election nonstop. That being said, I was surprised to see the UCP go so hard on this legislation that we have been calling just transition, but I know Wilkinson and Seamus O'Regan do not like that terminology. No. They're going to call it, I think, sustainable jobs, because they know just transition is not great terminology. It's not great communications. It sounds too definitive and bold. And I think this is what the federal government will say, is this is a jobs incentive act. It's nothing nefarious. It's not meant to wipe out the industry, but I think it goes on top of what is happening on a whole host of other energy and climate related legislation, like a cap on oil and gas emissions, which is also coming this year, like Bill C-69, which the Alberta government is still concerned about. No one in central Canada is really concerned about. So I think it is a cumulative effect of concern from the Alberta government. On this one particular act, I am surprised, because I think when we're talking about carrots and sticks in terms of energy and climate policy, it sounds like this is going to be a carrot policy. That is something that Alberta and the oil and gas industry would like to see, and they certainly would like to see all kinds of energy jobs, oil and gas and renewables.
Andrew?
I'm not sure the whole thing isn't misconceived. You always want to have transition programs for workers that are displaced from any industry for any reason. That's just part of a modern economy, is helping people make those shifts. I'm not sure why you necessarily need a special one for this. You can say, well, the government has caused their job loss because of their carbon pricing policies, but the government policies are always causing people to lose their jobs for one reason or another. Free trade caused a lot of job losses, also created a lot of jobs. And as part of that transition, people are going to go, so far as they're displaced from the oil and gas industry, are going to go to all kinds of different jobs in all kinds of different industries. There's no particular reason why they should be transitioning to renewable energy. That make a certain politicians' logic, but it doesn't actually fit with the real world. The real world, people are going to wind up in all kinds of different industries, and I don't think you want to prejudge that. So unless, of course, what you really want to do is subsidize renewables and subsidize green energy, which is what they want to do, and this gives you another handy hook to hang it on, oh, well, it's because we're helping workers. You can help workers without subsidizing particular industries.
Chantal.
I'm guessing in part subsidizing comes from the thinking that you have to compete with Joe Biden's policies on the same issue and ensure that Canada remains competitive, that it's not a backwater to the transitioning to a zero gas emission economy. So that's one. I agree with Kelly about the just transition. I'm old enough to think it reminds one too much of the Just Society of someone else who was called Trudeau. And I think maybe one should be wary of the word just in this context. But I agree with Andrew. This is, at best, only a small part in a puzzle that is governed by reality and not by governments. The federal government is not setting out to change Canada's economy. It's going to have to change. That is a competitive reality increasingly, especially when you look at what has been happening in the United States with the policies that are being put in place.
Last word to you, Althia.
Well, the truth is we don't actually know much about this bill. Cabinet has discussed it, but in the words of the Prime Minister's office today was they're still working on it. So there haven't been a lot of high-level province-to-province talks. There are still negotiations with unions, the labor movement. This is a bill that makes good on an election promise from the 2019 campaign to basically create a $2 billion fund to help green projects, green energy projects in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, as well as basically create this kind of like grand training center for not just workers who've lost their jobs, but workers who might wish to transition to new clean tech energy jobs to get the skills that they need. It's basically, I think, it was Kelly who said it, it's a carrots bill. But we haven't seen it yet, and it feels like a lot of it is just like a plan to have a plan. I think what's more interesting is the politics of the bill, and Kelly is absolutely right that this is going to be weaponized in the lead up to the Alberta election in the spring. And I think the risk for the UCP is when they go too far, when they start talking about how Ottawa wants to phase out all Alberta jobs, is that the party starts looking like a dinosaur, and you will have the federal Liberals all too pleased to say, we can't afford not to do a bill like this, that looking down south at what Joe Biden has done with the IRA, we need to do something like this.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much for this. Good to see you all back here in the new year. Kelly, thank you for joining us on this Thursday.